Mark stood at the edge of his property, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand, and watched Bessie chew. He hadn't named her. She'd already had it when he'd inherited her from his grandfather, a man who'd believed in a connection to the land that most of his neighbors would never understand. Bessie, a beautiful, placid Guernsey cow with a coat of rich brown and white, moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her tail flicking at a fly as she methodically cropped the grass. For Mark, she was a living, breathing connection to a simpler time. For the residents of the meticulously curated and aggressively orderly community of Whispering Pines, she was a four-legged, cud-chewing problem. He'd bought the house a month ago, a rambling ranch-style home on a full acre that felt like a quiet refuge in the midst of a suburban jungle. He'd done his due diligence, reading through the HOA bylaws, a dense tome of rules on everything from acceptable paint colors to the exact angle of porch lights. He had found no explicit mention of livestock and had interpreted the silence as an unspoken permission, especially considering the large plot of land. He was a simple man, a man who needed a purpose, and after his grandfather's passing, that purpose had become Bessie. He had no grand designs. Bessie just needed to be a cow, and he needed a little bit of her milk to make his morning coffee something worth getting out of bed for. The peace of his morning was shattered by the sound of staccato footsteps on his concrete driveway. He knew who it was before he even turned. Only one person in the neighborhood walked with such an aggressive, purposeful stride. Brenda, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She was a woman who saw the world in black and white, a world of rules and regulations, and Mark's brown and white cow was a violation of both. "Mr. Peterson," she announced, her voice clipped and sharp, the words practically flying out of her mouth like bullets. "We have a situation." Mark took a slow sip of his coffee. "Good morning, Brenda." "Don't give me that," she shot back, her perfectly coiffed hair refusing to budge in the gentle breeze. "I'm sure you're aware of the bylaws. Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, no livestock, fowl, or other animals not typically considered domestic pets shall be kept within the community boundaries without prior written approval from the HOA board." She held up a laminated card with the exact text, a habit she had of carrying around what she called her Community Standards Quick Reference Guide. "Bessie isn't kept in the traditional sense," Mark said, gesturing to the open field behind his house, a field of lush green grass that had become his pride and joy. "She's grazing." "Graze kept, what's the difference?" Brenda's nostrils flared. "It's a cow, Mr. Peterson, a cow." "This is not a farm. This is a residential community." Her eyes scanned his property, searching for a flaw. "The value of my home, our homes, is at risk. Brenda, she's a quiet animal. She doesn't make any noise, she doesn't bother anyone. She's just a cow." He almost laughed at the simplicity of it. He was a man with a cow. She was a woman with a laminated card, and they were at war. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial hiss. "This isn't about you, Mr. Peterson. This is about maintaining our standards. We worked very hard to make Whispering Pines a sanctuary, a place where people don't have to worry about this." She gestured with a wide, disgusted sweep of her arm. "You have until the end of the week to remove her, or we will be forced to escalate this matter." Mark felt the first real flicker of anger. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. It was about a woman who saw a simple, beautiful animal and felt a need to exert her power. "I'm not removing her, Brenda. I read the bylaws. She's not listed as a prohibited animal, and my property is well maintained. We will see about that." "Mr. Peterson," she said, and with a final withering glare, she spun on her heel and marched away, the crisp snap of her retreating footsteps a declaration of war. The next few days were a blur of escalating tension. First, an official-looking letter from the HOA, a formal notice of violation with a fine attached. Then, an email, copying the entire board, reiterating the demand and threatening further fines and legal action. Mark felt the walls closing in. He had moved here for peace, for the open space, for a quiet life with his cow, but instead, he'd found himself in the middle of a war he hadn't signed up for. He went to the next HOA meeting, held in Brenda's own immaculate white-walled living room. It was clear she considered her home the proper seat of power. Mark walked in, feeling like a country bumpkin who had stumbled into a parliament. Brenda was holding court, a triumphant smile on her face as she addressed the small group of residents. "I'm happy to report that we are making significant progress with the livestock situation on Elm Street," she announced, her eyes meeting his and holding them with a victorious glint. "Mr. Peterson has been issued a formal notice, and we anticipate the issue will be resolved shortly." A few of the other residents, a mix of curious onlookers and longtime allies of Brenda, nodded along. Mark sat silently, his hands clenched, feeling the heat rise in his face. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, but he wasn't ready to surrender. "I'm also happy to report that our community is in top shape," Brenda continued, her voice full of self-satisfaction. She beamed, gesturing out the expansive windows to her own lawn, a perfectly manicured sea of green that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. "You all know I take great pride in our community standards, and that includes the most important part of our curb appeal, our lawns." Mark's mind, which had been racing a moment ago, came to a sudden, screeching halt. He looked at Brenda's lawn, a perfect emerald carpet. He looked back at Brenda, her face flushed with pride. He looked down at the HOA bylaws on the coffee table, a new, meticulously organized binder. His eyes fell on a specific section. He had read it before, but in the chaos of the last few days, its true meaning had been lost. It was about unmaintained lawns. It detailed the procedure for issuing a notice of violation and, if the violation was not cured within 48 hours, the HOA's right to hire a professional service to correct the issue, billing the costs directly to the homeowner. It was the very same rule Brenda had used to threaten him. Mark stood up slowly, a strange calm settling over him. He felt the weight of every angry email, every threatening letter, every condescending glance from Brenda. It had all led to this. "Brenda," he said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the low hum of conversation. "A question, if I may." She looked at him, surprised, her triumphant smile momentarily faltering. "Yes, Mr. Peterson?" she said, the tone implying she had no time for his rural foolishness. "The bylaws," he said, holding her gaze. "They state that all grass must be maintained at a uniform height of no more than 3 inches, correct?" She nodded slowly, a hint of suspicion in her eyes. "That is correct. And that if the grass exceeds that height, the homeowner is issued a violation?" "Yes, Mr. Peterson, that is what happened to you." "Your property was in violation." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He pointed a finger out the window at the perfect lawn Brenda so cherished. "You see, Bessie is a very picky eater. She only grazes where the grass is lushest. And I've noticed she's been grazing a lot on your property line." Brenda's face went from pale to white. She glanced out the window, a frantic look in her eyes. The other residents followed her gaze. There was no visible difference, of course. "Her lawn was a masterpiece," Mark continued, his voice picking up a quiet strength. "It's a good thing you sent that notice. Because I just got off the phone with my grandfather's lawyer." He reminded me of a little-known fact. My land and yours were once part of the same parcel, divided in a way that left an old, unincorporated right-of-way between us. The grass on that right-of-way, according to my survey, is still my responsibility, which is why I never mowed it, and which is also why Bessie loved it so much. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Brenda was speechless, a cold fear in her eyes. "And," Mark said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "according to Article 7, Section 3, Subsection C of our bylaws, the HOA reserves the right to maintain any unkempt public or shared-use land and bill the responsible party for the services rendered." It was a bit of a trick, of course. The HOA's own rules are the ones that finally got her to do my job for me. "I'm sure you'll be getting the bill for the grass your cow mowed, Brenda." He was a man who had a cow, and he had been threatened with legal action and fines. Now, standing in her immaculate living room, he had just revealed a legal loophole that would send her the bill for the very thing she had tried to prevent him from doing. The justice was cold and swift. Brenda opened her mouth, her face a mask of disbelief and rage, but no sound came out. The rest of the board members stared at her, then at Mark, a collective gasp rippling through the room. A single thought echoed in the silent room. So that's why she was so passionate about it. Her lawn was the one in danger. The silence that followed Mark's final words was more deafening than any shout. The carefully constructed facade of order in Brenda's living room shattered like a dropped porcelain plate. The other residents, a mix of mild-mannered retirees and young families, stared at Brenda, then at the immaculate lawn visible through the window, then back at Brenda. The queen of the HOA, the self-proclaimed bastion of community standards, had been outmaneuvered by the new guy with a cow. Brenda's face, a mask of disbelief and fury, was a study in pure, unadulterated shock. The color drained from her cheeks, replaced by a mottled red that crept up her neck and into her hairline. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Mark simply stood there watching her, the calm victor in a battle she hadn't known she was losing. The right-of-way, stammered Mr. Abernathy, a meek-looking man who usually only spoke to complain about the trash can placement rules. Brenda, you mean, we've been maintaining a part of your lawn for you? Brenda finally found her voice, a strained, thin thing that barely registered above a whisper. It's a misinterpretation. Mark's lawyer is mistaken. That's not what the bylaws mean. It's not a misinterpretation, Mark said, his voice still low but with a new edge of steel. I have the original survey maps. My grandfather's lawyer sent me the parcel deeds and the legal description of the right-of-way. The HOA has a fiduciary duty to maintain the property according to the covenants, and since it's technically my land, the bill for that maintenance is my responsibility to pay. You just had Bessie do it for you, and now the HOA will bill you to fix the violation you've just discovered on your property that I have not mowed for 30 years. He walked to the coffee table, opened the new binder, and flipped through the pages. Article 7, Section 3, Subsection C. The HOA reserves the right to maintain any unkempt public or shared-use land and bill the responsible party for the services rendered. That's your rule, Brenda. Not mine. The meeting dissolved into a flurry of bewildered murmurs. People who had been her staunch allies suddenly looked away, uncomfortable. A few of the younger residents exchanged glances and quiet, suppressed snickers. Brenda was no longer the all-powerful leader. She was a woman who had been publicly humbled by a simple, undeniable fact. Mark knew he had won the battle, but he had a feeling the war was just beginning. As he left the meeting, he could feel Brenda's eyes boring into his back, filled with a hatred that promised revenge. The next morning, the first sign of the coming storm was the silence. The neighbors who had once waved cheerfully from their driveways now averted their eyes. Mark felt like a pariah, a living, breathing testament to Brenda's defeat. He knew she was at work, her campaign of vengeance in full swing. He was right. By noon, an email was sent to all Whispering Pines residents, titled Urgent Community Advisory. It was signed by Brenda as HOA Board President, a title he now knew was an unofficial one she had bestowed upon herself. The email didn't mention the cow nor the right-of-way. It simply announced a special emergency board meeting to discuss new community health and safety standards. It was a thinly veiled attack, and Mark knew it. He also knew that with the shock of yesterday's meeting still fresh, people would be more likely to side with her than him. He needed to prepare. Mark called his grandfather's lawyer, a wry old man named Harold, who had a mind like a steel trap. Harold, she's coming after me again. This time it's community health and safety standards. Ah, the classic bait and switch, Harold chuckled, a dry sound that barely made it through the phone. They can't touch the livestock issue, so they'll attack the periphery. Noise ordinances, waste disposal, sanitary conditions, that sort of thing. They'll try to find a way to argue that Bessie is a public health hazard. What do I do? Mark asked, a hint of desperation in his voice. You don't do anything, Harold advised. Let her come. She'll overreach. She always does. In the meantime, you need to find her weakness. There's a rule for everything in these bylaws, Mark, and if you find a rule she's broken, a single solitary rule, you'll have her. Mark hung up the phone, feeling a little better. He decided to take Harold's advice. He wasn't going to just sit back and wait for Brenda's next move. He was going to find his own. He spent the next 2 days poring over the bylaws, a highlight pen in his hand, a magnifying glass in the other. He read every single line, every subsection, every clause. He looked for loopholes, for inconsistencies, for anything that might give him an advantage. The bylaws were a labyrinth of rules, a tangled web of regulations designed to keep the community in check. But as he read, he noticed something strange. There were rules for everything. From the height of the lawn to the color of the mulch, everything was regulated. But there was one glaring omission. The bylaws were meticulously detailed about what you couldn't do, but they were remarkably vague about the HOA's own responsibilities. On the third day, the day of the emergency board meeting, the community was tense. Mark arrived, finding that the meeting wasn't at Brenda's house this time. It was at the community center, a more official and less personal setting. He realized that Brenda was trying to distance herself from yesterday's humiliation to regain her footing as a leader. He walked in and found the room buzzing with hushed conversation. Brenda was at the front, a new binder in her hands, her face a mask of solemn authority. She began to speak, her voice trembling slightly. As you all know, we take the health and safety of our community very seriously. It has come to our attention that we have a potential public health issue in our community, specifically the presence of a large animal, which could pose a risk to the children, the property values, and the overall aesthetic of our neighborhood. The room was silent, all eyes on her. She had come prepared. She had printed out documents from a dubious online source about the risks of livestock, and she had photos of what she claimed were unsanitary conditions on his property. It was all a complete fabrication, but he knew that in a world of rules, the truth was often secondary to a good argument. We have a responsibility to act, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Therefore, I have drafted a new bylaw. It states that any resident with a non-domestic animal must pass a health and sanitation inspection every month at their own expense. And if they fail to comply, the HOA reserves the right to remove the animal in question. A wave of shock rippled through the room. This wasn't a fine, this was an eviction. Mark's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about the grass. This was about Bessie. It was about everything. He had to stop her. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. Brenda, may I ask you a question? She looked at him, her eyes filled with a cold, triumphant fire. She knew she had him. She knew she had won. I suppose so, Mr. Peterson, but I suggest you save your breath. This is a matter of community safety. It's about a different kind of safety, Mark said, his voice surprisingly calm. He held up a page from the bylaws, a page he had highlighted just that morning. I've been reading the bylaws, Brenda, a lot, and I found something interesting. A section on community safety that I don't think you've ever paid attention to. He walked to the front of the room, his eyes fixed on hers. She looked at him with a mix of fear and contempt, but she didn't back down. The rest of the community watched in silent fascination. This was more than a meeting. It was a showdown. Article 9, Section 1, Mark said, holding up the document. The HOA and its board members shall be held liable for any damages, negligence, or malfeasance that result from a failure to maintain the community's infrastructure, including but not limited to the communal water lines, electrical grids, and storm drains. Brenda's expression didn't change, but Mark could see a flicker of doubt in her eyes. So, she said, we maintain those things, do you? Mark asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. I received a letter from the city this morning. A copy was sent to the HOA board. It seems the main storm drain on the south side of the community has collapsed, a major structural issue. It's been that way for a month that has seen 2 major rainstorms. The city says it's on us, the HOA, to fix it, and they've given us a deadline. The projected cost is astronomical. And as the board president, Brenda, the bylaws say that you and the rest of the board are liable for the damages to the community's infrastructure. Your lawn is perfect, Brenda, but your infrastructure is crumbling, and now the entire community is on the hook. And guess who's on the board that neglected to fix the storm drain? And guess who just happens to be a perfect scapegoat for a lawsuit, a perfect person to claim negligence and malfeasance? You. Brenda stared at him, her carefully constructed world of rules and power crumbling around her. She had been so focused on taking down Mark, on destroying his peace, that she had been blind to the real danger. The very bylaws she used as a weapon against him were now poised to become her undoing. The irony was poetic. She had tried to evict his cow, and in doing so, she had just put her own reputation, her own power, and possibly her own financial stability on the line. The collective intake of breath in the community center meeting room was a physical force, a gust of shocked air that hit Mark with the force of a blow. All eyes were on Brenda, but she saw only Mark, her nemesis, standing before her, a calm, implacable wall of a man who had somehow impossibly seen through her every move. Her carefully constructed world, built on the shifting sands of rules and regulations, was collapsing around her, and she was the last one to know it. "This is a lie," she hissed, her voice a thin wire of fury. "There is no collapsed storm drain. This is a fabrication, a cheap trick." A man in the back, a short, balding fellow named George, who had been on the board for 3 years, nervously cleared his throat. "Brenda," he began, his voice a hesitant tremor. I got the same letter this morning. I was going to call you. It's from the city's public works department." Brenda's head snapped around, her eyes wide with a desperate, trapped animal's fear. You didn't say anything," she stammered. I was trying to figure out what to do," George mumbled, his gaze fixed on his shoes. It's a big problem." Brenda's composure completely evaporated. She looked from George to Mark, then to the rest of the silent, watching community members. The room, which had been buzzing with support for her just moments ago, was now a hostile, silent jury. She saw the doubt in their eyes, the dawning realization that they had been manipulated, that she had been trying to get rid of Mark's cow while a far more significant and expensive problem loomed. She finally turned her full attention back to Mark. "You did this," she said, the accusation a venomous dart. "You orchestrated this. You're trying to ruin me. You think you can just come in here with your farm animal and turn the entire community against me?" "I didn't orchestrate anything." "Brenda," Mark said, his voice level and calm, a stark contrast to her near-hysterical tone. "I just read the bylaws. You were so busy trying to use them as a weapon against me, you didn't realize they were a weapon pointed at you, too." The meeting ended in a state of chaos. People, no longer looking to Brenda for direction, began to argue amongst themselves. What did this mean? Who was responsible? How much would it cost? The focus had completely shifted from Bessie to the storm drain, from a minor aesthetic issue to a major financial disaster. And at the center of it all stood Brenda, the architect of her own downfall. The next day, the emails started. They weren't from Brenda, but from other community members. They were addressed to Mark, a silent plea for information. "Do you really have the survey maps? What does the city's letter say? How much will this cost us?" He was no longer the outsider, the weird guy with the cow. He was a source of information, a beacon of truth in a sea of Brenda's deceptions. Mark's phone rang. It was George. "Mark," he said, his voice a low, hurried whisper, "we're holding a special impromptu board meeting, without Brenda. We need to figure out what to do about the storm drain. We're going to talk about a motion of no confidence in her leadership." The tide had turned. Mark knew it. Brenda had overplayed her hand, and the very board she had dominated for years was now moving to oust her. He didn't go to the meeting. He didn't need to. He knew that George and the others would do the right thing. But Brenda, Mark knew, wouldn't go down without a fight. She had lost the board, but she hadn't lost her anger, her pride, her desperate need for control. She had one last card to play, a desperate act of vengeance that would either restore her power or completely destroy her. The next morning, Mark awoke to a strange silence. Bessie wasn't outside. His heart hammered in his chest. He rushed out, his bare feet hitting the dewy grass. The small temporary electric fence he had used to contain Bessie was gone. No, not gone. It was cut. The wires were severed. A clean, deliberate cut. Bessie was gone. He ran to the back of the property, his eyes scanning the fields. Nothing. He called her name, his voice a frantic shout. The sound echoed back, swallowed by the still morning air. His grandfather's parting gift, the last link to a man he had loved and admired, was gone. He knew who had done it. It was so obvious, so ridiculously, childishly vindictive, it could only have been Brenda. He could see it, the rage and frustration, boiling over, the inability to control the situation leading her to this petty, cruel act. She had tried to get rid of Bessie with rules, and when that had failed, she had resorted to thievery. Mark called the police. He reported the missing cow and the vandalism. The officer on the phone, who sounded like a nice enough guy, listened patiently, but with a note of skepticism in his voice. "A cow, sir? Stolen? In a suburban neighborhood?" Mark could almost hear the man's suppressed laughter. He understood. It sounded absurd, but it was the truth. An hour later, as Mark was walking the neighborhood, a sense of hopelessness growing. With every step, he saw a police cruiser parked in front of Brenda's house. He stopped, his heart pounding. The front door was open, and he could see 2 police officers inside, talking to a visibly distraught Brenda. A third officer was in the backyard, shining a flashlight on something hidden behind a large bush. Mark walked closer, a sense of grim anticipation growing inside him. He didn't have to get close to know what they had found. He could smell it. The unmistakable, pungent smell of manure. He saw the officer stoop down and emerge with a small plastic bag, a grim smile on his face. He came to the front and spoke to the officer talking to Brenda. "Sir, we have our evidence. It's a clear violation of the county's public health ordinance. There's a large amount of manure and it's been dumped on her property line. A clear biohazard, sir. The health department's going to have a field day with this." Brenda's face, which had been a mask of defiance moments ago, crumpled. She had been so focused on getting rid of Bessie, on making Mark's life a living hell, that she had decided to make a public show of it. She had stolen his cow, driven her to a remote location, and then, in a fit of twisted genius, had decided to dump a huge pile of manure in front of her own home. A final, desperate act of spite to show the community what Mark and his filthy animal were really like. Mark felt the cold, hard weight of karma settle over the community. She had been so desperate to prove that he was a public health hazard that she had created the very hazard she had warned against. The irony was devastating. Her final, desperate act of vengeance was the very thing that would finally, truly, and irrevocably put her in the wrong. She hadn't just made herself an outcast, she had made herself a criminal. And the very city officials she had tried to use as her puppets were now going to come after her with a vengeance. The officer looked at Mark. "Mr. Peterson, we found some tracks. Looks like a truck, maybe a van. We'll find your cow, sir." He then looked back at Brenda, his face a grim, stony mask. "As for you, ma'am, we have a public health code violation. I'm going to have to write you up for that. And if this is what you're doing in your neighborhood, then I'm afraid this is going to get a lot worse for you, because we have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior. The community and your HOA is going to have to decide how they want to handle a problem like this, and I have a feeling they are going to agree with us that this is not a community standard that anyone is going to want to accept." Brenda simply stared at the pile of manure, her jaw slack, her eyes vacant. She had thrown everything she had at Mark, and in doing so, she had only succeeded in ruining herself. The storm drain, the legal threats, the loss of the board, it all paled in comparison to the pure, unadulterated reality of the pile of manure in her front yard. She had tried to prove that Mark was a threat to the community, and in doing so, she had revealed that she was the real threat all along, the ultimate act of karmic justice. The silence in front of Brenda's meticulously manicured home was now a living, breathing thing, punctuated only by the distant squawk of a blue jay and the low murmur of police radios. The police officer's words hung in the air, a final, unassailable declaration of her defeat. He was walking away, a small, evidence-filled plastic bag clutched in his hand, leaving Brenda to stare at the steaming, odorous pile of manure on her own pristine lawn. The neighbors, once her loyal subjects, were now a silent, judging gallery, their faces a mixture of disgust and a sort of horrified schadenfreude. Brenda's world, a fortress built of rules and reputation, had been breached, not by Mark's gentle cow, but by her own hubris. She had tried to prove him a public nuisance, and in her final act of spite, she had become one herself. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that it was almost biblical. Mark didn't linger. The sight of her crumbling was not satisfying. It was simply pathetic. His mind was consumed with a single desperate thought: Bessie. He had to find her. The police had promised to help, but he knew the odds of finding a stolen cow in a suburban neighborhood were slim to none. He began to walk, his eyes scanning every back road, every field, every quiet cul-de-sac. He was a man possessed, a frantic shepherd searching for his lost lamb. His phone, which had been silent for days, now buzzed with a stream of messages. They were from the neighbors. Not the angry ones, but the quiet ones. Heard what happened. We're on the lookout for a brown and white cow. My son saw a strange truck near your house last night. A white van. Didn't get the license plate, though. I've started a neighborhood chat group to coordinate a search. We're with you, Mark. The very community that had ostracized him now rallied to his side. They had seen Brenda's true colors, and the illusion of her power had been shattered. They had been forced to choose, and they had chosen the cow over the queen. An hour later, as Mark was about to give up the search, his phone rang. It was the police officer from Brenda's house. "Mr. Peterson," the officer said, his voice grim. "We've got a lead. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was premeditated. The owner of the white van just confessed. We found Bessie." Mark's heart soared, then plummeted. "Where is she? Is she okay?" "She's fine physically," the officer said. "But, well, you'd better get down here. We've got her at the county auction house. But there's a complication, a legal one, and it's a big one." The county livestock auction house was a chaotic, sprawling place, a world away from the manicured lawns of Whispering Pines. The air, thick with the smell of hay and manure, was alive with the sounds of mooing cattle and the loud, rapid-fire pronouncements of the auctioneer. Mark found Bessie in a holding pen, her head low, her eyes sad. She was no longer the serene, placid cow he knew. She was scared, her placid nature replaced by a sense of deep confusion. He reached through the bars and stroked her head, his heart aching with a mixture of relief and a fierce, protective anger. "I'm so sorry, girl," he whispered. "I'll get you out of here." The police officer was waiting for him outside the pen, a tired expression on his face. He held up a clipboard with some paperwork. "Mr. Peterson, this is where it gets complicated. The driver of the van, a man named Bob, says he was hired by a woman who said she needed to move her livestock. He took the cow, a large payment, and delivered her here to be sold. A few minutes later, he came back, and she had him dump a pile of manure on the lawn. It was a whole thing. She said the cow's owner was an uncooperative hoarder, and she needed the cow removed to clean up the property." Mark's mind reeled. This wasn't a petty act of vengeance. This was a sophisticated, thought-out crime. This was theft, but she can't just sell my cow, Mark exclaimed, his voice incredulous. The officer shook his head. She didn't. She sold it under a false name with fabricated paperwork. But the sale went through, and this morning Bessie was officially sold to a new owner, a man named Mr. Thompson. He paid cash. The sale is legally binding. The auction house has the paperwork. And now so does Mr. Thompson. Mark's blood ran cold. He had outsmarted Brenda on the rules, but she had outsmarted him on the law. She hadn't just stolen Bessie. She had tried to erase her from his life forever, to make a final permanent act of destruction. We can't just take her back? Mark asked, a hint of desperation in his voice. The officer sighed. We can hold her here while the investigation proceeds, but unless Mr. Thompson agrees to give her up, she's legally his. He bought her in good faith, with what he thought was legitimate paperwork. We've tried to contact him, but he's not answering his phone. We've also issued a warrant for Brenda's arrest for grand theft. This is no longer a civil matter, Mr. Peterson. This is a criminal one. The gravity of the situation hit Mark with the force of a punch. Brenda had gone from a petty tyrant to a full-fledged criminal. But that didn't help him. Bessie was still a prisoner. He looked at her, standing in the pen, her sad eyes fixed on his. He had to do something. Just then, a man, a hulking figure in a stained denim jacket, walked into the auction office, a clipboard in his hand. It was Mr. Thompson. The auction manager, a kind-eyed man with a weathered face, saw Mark's desperation and quickly explained the situation to Mr. Thompson, who listened with a stern, unyielding expression. I bought that cow. Son, Thompson said, his voice a low growl. I got a contract. She's mine. I don't care what your neighbor did. I paid for her and she's going on my truck to my farm. Mark felt a wave of despair. There was no reasoning with this man. This was a business transaction, and he was a man of business. The auction manager, however, stepped in. Mr. Thompson, I've seen a lot of things in this business. A lot of good people and a lot of bad ones. This here's a good man who just had his cow stolen from him. You can do the right thing here. You can sell him the cow back for what you paid for her, and we can void the contract. It's the only way to make this right. Thompson stared at the auction manager, then at Mark. His eyes narrowed. I got a business to run, he said again, his voice unyielding. Mark stepped forward. Please, sir, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. That cow. She's more than just an animal to me. She was a gift from my grandfather. She's all I have left of him. I'll pay you double what you paid for her, triple, whatever you want. Just, please, don't take her from me. The farmer's face remained a stony mask, but Mark saw a flicker of something in his eyes. A glimpse of an old memory, a moment of empathy. He was a man who worked the land, and he understood the bond between a man and his animal. He looked at Mark, at his desperate eyes, at the cow in the pen, and he saw something he hadn't seen before. He turned back to the auction manager. Look, he said, his voice a little softer. I'll sell the cow back to him, but not for money. He turned to Mark. You can have her back, son, but only if you can get the person who did this to sign a statement that she illegally sold this animal to me under fraudulent pretenses. I want this in writing for my own legal protection. Mark stared at him, his mind reeling. He was being given a chance, but it came with a price. He had to go back to Brenda. He had to face her, not as an opponent, but as a man asking for a favor. He had to put his pride aside and ask her to confess to a crime that could send her to prison. He had to beg her, for the sake of his cow. It was the ultimate test. It was no longer about winning. It was about mercy. The justice he had so eagerly sought had come with an unexpected and incredibly difficult final act. The sun was setting as Mark drove back into Whispering Pines. The perfectly manicured suburban lawns, once a symbol of his new life's quiet promise, now felt like a stage for a tragicomedy. He gripped the steering wheel, a copy of the notarized statement from Mr. Thompson lying on the passenger seat. His heart was a drum in his chest, a mix of hope and dread. He was about to do the unthinkable, ask his enemy for mercy. He found Brenda's house, a silhouette of disgrace in the fading light. The police tape was gone, but the immense dark stain on her lawn was a permanent scar. The air still carried a faint, acrid odor. He saw her through the window, sitting in her pristine living room, a solitary figure in a wingback chair. She was not a queen, not a tyrant. She was just a woman, defeated. Mark took a deep breath and walked to her front door. He didn't knock. He simply opened the screen door and walked into her world. She didn't flinch, didn't even turn her head. She just sat there staring into the dark void of her now empty fireplace. Brenda, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all triumph. I need to talk to you. She finally turned, her eyes hollow, ringed with red. Come to gloat, Mark? She said, her voice a cracked whisper. To watch me burn? It's all you ever wanted. That's not what I want, he said, and he meant it. He knelt on the spotless Persian rug, placing the document on the coffee table between them. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for Bessie." He explained everything, his voice calm and even. The theft, the sale at the auction, the deal with Mr. Thompson. He told her how her desperate act of spite had almost cost him the last piece of his grandfather he had left. Brenda listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, he simply sat there, waiting. "You want me to sign a confession?" she finally asked, her voice raspy. "To admit that I'm a thief? To get your cow back?" "Yes," Mark said, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't get her back without it. This is a criminal matter now, Brenda. The police have a warrant for your arrest for grand theft. You've gone from breaking HOA rules to breaking the law. But Mr. Thompson is willing to drop the sale if you sign this. This is your only way out. Your only way to get some dignity back." Her lip curled into a sneer. "And you think you're helping me? You think I'm going to give you what you want, Mark? You think I'm going to admit I lost? This isn't about winning or losing anymore," he said, his voice rising with a desperate plea. "This is about a life, Brenda. It's about a bond between a man and an animal. You've lost your community, your pride, your power. Don't lose your humanity, too. Don't let your anger cost me the last thing I have." Brenda stared at him, at the raw emotion on his face, at the desperation in his eyes. She saw something she had never seen before. A man stripped of pretense, a man who loved something more than his own pride. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The rage, the venom, it all drained away, replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. She had destroyed so much to get here, and for what? A pile of manure and a criminal record. She picked up the pen from the coffee table, her hand trembling. She looked at the document, a final, painful admission of her complete and utter failure. She looked at Mark, his face a mask of hope and fear, and then she signed her name. Brenda's final act as the queen of the HOA was not an order, not a demand, but a surrender, a confession. The next day, Mark returned to the auction house. He handed the signed document to Mr. Thompson, who read it over, his expression softening as he went. He looked at Mark, then at Bessie in the holding pen, and a rare smile broke across his face. "A man's word is his bond," he said, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "And a man's love for his animal. Well, that's a different kind of bond. Your cow's not for sale, son. She's going home." The auction manager tore up the original contract, and a few minutes later, Mark was leading Bessie out of the auction house, her head held high, her tail swishing with a sense of quiet triumph. He walked her all the way home, a triumphant procession through the streets of Whispering Pines. The neighbors came out of their houses, cheering for them, waving and shouting. Mark, once an outcast, was now the community hero. They had found their champion, not in a rule-obsessed tyrant, but in a man who loved his cow more than he loved his pride. When they reached his lawn, Mark looked at the right-of-way, the grass that had started this entire conflict. It was now a lush, vibrant green, freshly mowed and weed-free. The neighbors had come together and fixed the mess Brenda had made. The HOA, now under the new Democratic leadership of George, had held a meeting to pass new bylaws, not about controlling the community, but about protecting it. And at the top of the list was a new resolution. No resident shall be fined for a cow, provided said cow has a valid health permit. Mark stood on his lawn watching Bessie graze peacefully. He had a new appreciation for the simple, quiet beauty of his land. He had fought a battle he never wanted to fight, and he had won. Not with rules, not with legal documents, but with kindness, with a little help from his friends, and with a cow who was worth more than all the pride in the world. He looked at the perfectly mowed lawn, then at the still-stained lawn of Brenda's, and he realized the true price of her spite. She had wanted to destroy his life, but she had only succeeded in destroying her own. And in the end, all she had left was a bill for the grass he had to mow. That's the end of the story. It was an incredible journey to tell, and I hope you